Okay, today we're going to talk about graphing sine and cosine with shifts. So let's get right into it. It says, on the axes below, graph one cycle of a cosine function with amplitude 3, period pi over 2, midline at y equals -1, and passing through the point 0, 2. Okay. So let's write down what we know. It's always helpful. Amplitude is 3. Frequency we don't know. That's okay. Period is pi over 2. So we can find our critical values. That's period divided by 4. So pi over 2 divided by 4 is pi over 8. So I'm going to have critical value every pi over 8. And we know the midline is y equals -1. So I like to get the range. So the way I get the range is, I think what the range would have been before I had a shift. So the range would have been -3 to 3. But I had a shift. I shifted down 1. So my range is now -4 to 2. Okay. So let's draw in, well, let's actually set up our y's. So I'm just going to go by 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So my midline is at y equals -1. So that's going to be here. I like to draw that in. Okay. So let's fill in our critical values. So every pi over 8. So that's pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, that's pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, and 4 pi over 8, which is pi over 2. And they only want us to graph one cycle of a cosine. Okay, so we know, I'm just going to do a little highlight. We know the highest y is 2, and we know the lowest y is -4, and we also have our midline. So we graph it the same way we've graphed all our cosines. So this tells us it goes through the point 0, 2. Well, that's good. It goes through the highest. That's the first critical value. Then at the next critical value, we're going to go to the midline. So it used to be the x-axis was the midline, but now we have our new midline. Then at our next critical value, we're going to go down to the lowest. Then back up to the midline, and then back up to the highest. And connect. And that's it. I think they ask us to write an equation. So we know everything but the frequency. So let's think about, we know the period is pi over 2. And I know the formula for period is 2 pi over frequency. So let's set that equal to pi over 2. Let's cross multiply. So 4 equals the frequency. Okay, so now we have everything we need. Y equals, amplitude is 3. We know it's a cosine, 4x. And then we can't forget about, just need a little more room. We can't forget that we moved it down 1, so -1. Okay, let's look at another one. On the axes below, sketch at least one cycle of a sine curve with an amplitude of 2, midline at y equals 2, and a period of 2 pi. So amplitude's 2. We don't know the frequency, but we do know the period. And that's 2 pi. I'm just going to write a little bit over here. So let's do the critical values is period over 4. So 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So every pi over 2, I have a critical value. So we could set that up. Pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. Okay, the midline is at y equals 2. Sorry. Okay. So the midline is at y equals 2. So I'm going to draw that in. And then it probably would be a good idea to get the range. So remember how we did that, or how I like to do it is the range would have been -2 to 2, since that's the amplitude, but everything got moved up 2. We had a shift of 2. That's why the midline is at 2. So then my lowest is now 0, and my highest is now 4. Okay, I think I have everything I need to graph. So it's a sine curve, so it starts at the midline. Then at the first critical value, it goes up to the highest, which in this case is 4. Then back to the midline at the next critical value. Then back to the lowest, which in this case is 0. Then back up to the midline. And it says sketch at least one cycle, so we'll just do one. And that makes sense. It has a period of 2 pi. It ended at 2 pi. I do want to point out that the amplitude is 2. From the midline to the highest is 2, or the midline to the lowest is 2. And it doesn't ask us to, but let's make ourselves an equation. So y equals, well, it's 2 sine. This one's kind of nice to see the frequency because I can just look. How many cycles do I see from 0 to 2 pi? Well, I happened to graph to 2 pi and I saw one cycle. So 1x and then plus 2. I'm going to do one more with you. So this is just giving us a plain old equation. So let's write out all that we know. We have our amplitude is 3. Our frequency is 2. Our period is 2 pi over 2, so that's pi. Our critical values are pi over 4. Remember, that's period divided by 4. Okay, let's do the range. It would have been -3 to 3, but I have to shift down 1, so it's -4 to 2. Okay, that's good. And let's set up our axes. Okay. We're graphing, oh, I didn't really need to go. Actually, I'm going to fix that. Not that it really matters, but since we're only doing 0 to 2 pi, I could start all the way on the left. Okay. All right, so let's label. I have to go to 2 pi. Okay, so pi over 4 is my first, then 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2, then 3 pi over 4, then 4 pi over 4, which is pi, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, and 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi. Okay, so we know I need to go at least down to -4 and at least up to 2. Drawing my midline. My midline is at -1, right? -1. Okay. All right, I think we're all set. If we want to do a little highlight, just to kind of remind ourselves, we're going down to -4. Here's the midline, and we're going up to 2. Okay. So, let's do our graph. We're at sine, so we start at the midline. That would be here. Then it's positive, so we go up to the highest, back to the midline, down to the lowest, midline, highest, midline, lowest, midline. And there we go. Let's just do a quick check of a few things. The amplitude should be 3. 1, 2, 3, yep, okay. We did graph from 0 to 2 pi, that was nice, so we should see 2 cycles. Here's 1, here's 2, so that's nice, and that's it. Okay, I have one more for you to do on your own and hand in. Bye.